Welcome to Peoples and Things, a podcast about human life with technology. I'm your host, Lee Vinsel, an associate professor of science, technology, and society at Virginia Tech. You can reach me with comments and suggestions at leevinsel@gmail.com or on Twitter at STS_news. I would love to hear from you.
The fact that inequality has been rising in many countries, but especially in the United States, for many of the years between the 1970s and today is not news, or shouldn't be. It has been a hot topic of conversation for decades, and it is an issue that I'll be examining from many angles in my book project, A Good History of Shit Jobs. Answers to the question, what has caused rising inequality, are disputed. But one set of answers has been put forward by the French economist Thomas Piketty. His book, Capital in the 21st Century, published in English in 2014, became something of a bestseller, though it was without a doubt a book more often purchased and discussed than actually read. In that book, Piketty argues that one driver of inequality is that over the long term, and by long term I mean more than 200 years of history, there are higher returns on capital than labor. That is, you make more money from money than you do from working a job. Wealth begets wealth, which leads to a small, economically dominant class. In his 2019 follow-up book, Capital and Ideology, Piketty argues that over the course of history, societies have had varying ideological justifications for inequality. That is, unequal societies develop stories that make their inequities seem natural, even inevitable. Now, in both books, Piketty makes historical arguments, though he is an economist, not a historian. But do his historical arguments actually hold up? Are they accurate? Unlike some folks, I think this is a very important question, because moral action requires understanding how the world is. And as we try to point at something like moral truth, and my God, we could talk for days about what that might mean, we must come to see the world as it is to the best of our ability, which is not to suggest that we can ever arrive at a single shared picture of reality. That would be naive. But our moral and political lives have nothing to fear from the truth, or at least that's what I'd argue. And it's for this reason that I was so excited to see that two of my historian friends, Jonathan Coopersmith and Andrew Popp, pulled together a special issue of the journal History Compass on Piketty's book, Capital and Ideology. The special issue brings together essays on the book by historians who work on the history of business and capitalism. They interrogate Piketty's historical claims, but do so in a sympathetic manner. None of them are completely opposed to Piketty's project. Indeed, they all find it valuable. Jonathan Coopersmith is a historian of technology and a retired professor of history from Texas A&M. Earlier in his career, he wrote about the electricity industry in Russia and the Soviet Union, and later he wrote the fun book, Faxed, The Rise and Fall of the Fax Machine. Andrew Popp is a professor of history at Copenhagen Business School and editor-in-chief of Enterprise and Society, a journal of business history put out by the Business History Conference. Andy is also doing some really cutting-edge work on the history of capitalism and the emotions, including one of the most original essays I have read in ages, and I can't wait to see it published eventually. In this conversation with Coopersmith and Popp, I talked to them about why they thought it worthwhile to bring the attention of historians to bear on Piketty's historical arguments and what they learned in the process. I had a lot of fun talking to them, as you'll see, and I hope you enjoy our conversation. Get excited! Andy and Jonathan, thanks so much for taking the time to talk to me today.
Thank you very much for inviting us to be on.
Yeah, my pleasure.
And I suppose we should have settled beforehand whether we're going to call him Piketty or Piketty. Is Piketty more proper? Do you guys know the pronunciation?
I don't know. I always say Piketty, but it's probably wrong.
Me too.
But it's one of those words that you see written down much more than you hear spoken.
That's right.
Although I have met him and seen him speak, but I still don't know how it's.
Yeah.
Don't know how it's said.
Yeah, we could always just say the sociologist and leave it at that.
Maybe we should start off for listeners who haven't read Piketty's book, Capital and Ideology, spelling out, in a kind of bare framework, like what his argument is and why you thought it would be good to have historians respond to that book. Andy, do you want to give the first shot?
Yeah, okay. Well, it should really be Jonathan, because I actually wasn't in on this project from the word go. I joined slightly later, but I can have the first shot. So Piketty's argument in like 2 sentences for a 1,000-page plus book is that all societies have what he calls an inequality regime, which justifies and maintains a particular level of inequality in that society. These regimes are overwhelmingly ideological, but also institutional. And that if we look at history, we can see a pattern of kind of evolutionary stages through which societies tended to move in early modern and modern history in terms of their progression through a series of inequality regimes. So that's the argument in a nutshell. And Piketty is someone who's deeply concerned about the corrosive political and social and economic effects of inequality, which he sees as worsening and increasing. And he wants to find a kind of corrective participatory politics to deal with that. And I think we wanted to engage with it as historians because this is really a history book. Piketty is an economist, but reviewing the introduction we wrote, Jonathan and I wrote before joining you, something we really emphasize is that this is a book of historical scholarship. He's historically minded in this book. This isn't just a matter of longitudinal data, of which there's a very large amount, but also of an essentially historical analytical framework. And he believes vitally that a proper historical understanding of where we are today can help us imagine a better future. So, in essence, he deserves our engagement as historians, and not just as some kind of interloper from economics who's going to come in and say, you're doing this all wrong. It's just a serious engagement with history. So, Jonathan, did I say too much?
No, I think you said it far more eloquently and comprehensively than I would have. And he also comes to us having sold with his previous book over, I think it was over 1 or 2 million copies. So when we have someone who's a bestseller and saying, I'm taking history seriously, we think that we as historians have an obligation to take him seriously. And which means not just, oh wow, an economist is saying we matter, but let's look at what he's doing, and where can we go together from here, both in terms of how can we improve what he's doing, and maybe he's given us a couple of kicks in the pants. Again, from an economics perspective, he's outselling my books by a couple orders of magnitude, if not several. So he's got to be doing something right, and let's see what we can learn from
Is it fair to say that most of the folks you brought together work in business history? I mean, we all have multiple overlapping subfields that we work in, and they're different often. But is everyone basically you brought together? Is it fair to say they're business historians amongst other identities professionally?
We take business history seriously. Some of us, it's primary. Others of us are historians of technology who. Yeah. So I think we're a mixed bunch, and I think one of our strengths is that Piketty is not that concerned about the details of business and technology.
Yeah.
To him, he mostly treats them as a black box.
Yeah, I think all of us have business history either as a primary or secondary identity or affiliation.
Yeah.
And it's probably that reflects our networks, but also I guess some of the choices that we took in terms of trying to bring people on board. Yeah, I was just going to say, and also even so even if we say we're business historians, that's nowadays a really big tent.
It is.
So yeah, and go ahead.
Okay, and this did start out as a roundtable at the Business History Conference in March of 2020, which was one of indeed the last conference I attended before COVID. And I should say our one of the highlights of that conference was a group shot of people in the book room. We were all jammed together holding books and wearing our COVID protection using the latest scientific or medical advice, because we all had our blue latex gloves on as we're holding up the book.
Well, what I was thinking when I asked about this,
I was not there.
Yeah, I wasn't. I didn't make that either because it was right it was right when COVID was kind of like shutting everything down. That conference happened. But when I asked about this business history thing, part of what I think it's true, as you point out in that introduction, that Piketty, when he accounts for inequality, he doesn't really get into business and technology in any detailed way. It's also true that even though business history has changed a lot over the last couple decades and has really opened up the kinds of topics you can handle under that umbrella or tent, inequality has not traditionally been a big topic at the Business History Conference, I don't think, right? And the effects of the roles of entrepreneurs and capitalists and CEOs on inequality, that's not been a traditional topic. So it kind of goes in two directions. Is that fair?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. So some clarification, Lee. What goes in two directions?
Well, that maybe to use Jonathan's kick in the pants metaphor. I mean, there is it encourages business historians to maybe open up to this as an important topic that they should be exploring too.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you're right that it hasn't been a topic. Some historians have studied it, but business historians have not typically been very concerned about things like inequality, the impact of the social impact of business activities. And I think, although business history has studied politics, for example, the relationship between the history of conservatism in America in the 20th century and its relationship to business via lobbying, for example, those kinds of things have been topics in business history, but business history itself has never really had a politics.
Yeah.
I think, there's kind of been a subsumed politics that, business broadly with some hiccups and some setbacks, has increased wealth and is largely a societal good
Yeah.
So there's not much critical political distance from business in business history, I would say. Even as we've kind of come to criticize business in relationship, for example, to gender and race, there's not been a kind of fundamental political critical distance, I don't think, to business.
Yeah.
In the business history community.
Yeah. And it's and the number of political economists or people who study political economy and business history is fairly small. But I think it is a growing number too, as we realize that even pre-Piketty, there's a growing awareness or sense of the questions and, from an academic perspective, the opportunities of, wow, we can really ask, we can use our skill set, our questions into this area and make a contribution too. And Piketty deserves a great deal of credit for bringing this, just raising the question of inequality, bug, feature, local, and that's what we were looking at. That's what this collection was all about.
Yeah. I was thinking about Mark Levinson, the guy, the historian who wrote the book The Box about the rise of shipping containers. He has a newer book called like After the Box or something like that, which, inequality and, the issues of globalization are much more central to that second book, with thinking about how these kinds of issues have affected people in various nations. So it seems like there is a kind of shift in the field, or at least some people are kind of opening things up. And I think that's great. So, Jonathan, there's 6, there's your guys' introduction, and then there's 6 essays in the special issue. So is there a logic here that, is there a reason they're in the order they're in? Starting with Ken Lee Partito and running through Johann Matthew?
The 6 were chosen basically because they are really first-rate historians with good, who ask good questions, do good research, and write well. The groups are basically posed into sort of, we broke this into 2 approaches, or 2 groups. One looking at structure and arguments, and the other looking at it from specific history with the boots on the ground, going from foxhole to foxhole. So sort of, if you want to be crude, well, maybe not crude, sort of macro and micro approaches. I think we all take Piketty very seriously, but trying to look at him both from our terms and what he's trying to, what he says he's trying to accomplish. And I should say, one of the distinctions between what Piketty is doing and what a lot of historians do is that he's basically beating the Toscan. He's raising the flag and saying, this is a serious challenge. And jumping forward a bit, he just came out with a new book, A Brief History of Equality, where he's saying our goal is to look at the past to change the present for a better future. So he's got, he very much has an agenda here, but it's also a very open agenda. He's saying here's our goal, but he's also using history as an example. Said, and if we don't do this, bad things are going to happen, because he's talking about we have a pattern of rising inequality and then it snaps back. But the way it usually snaps back is through really nasty dislocations like war and revolution. And he's actually very much in a gradualist approach. Hey, let's work at this now to avoid World War III.
Yes.
So,
And so I think that so the first three essays are kind of methodological, or thinking about the work of history and what we do as historians. And I think that, a common reaction amongst historians, at least stereotypically or in a kind of caricature way, is when they encounter these kind of big history things that are kind of like big theories of historical change, they bristle at this because it's just like too far away and too remote. But in the first essay about Ken Lee Partito, titled A Feeling for History, I really saw him kind of trying to make a case for Piketty's approach, right? And almost, not defend him, but say there's, let alone, God forbid an economist putting forward big picture, theories of historical change. That's the worst nightmare for some historians. But I saw Ken saying like, no, like this guy is not like the worst kind of economist we can imagine doing this work. So Andy, say a bit what you saw Ken saying about Piketty.
Well, first of all, I'm exemplify that tendency amongst historians to, I don't read. I haven't read Jared Diamond.
Right.
I haven't read Harari.
Right. That guy's a real nightmare. Yeah.
yeah. I just read a big. I do have the Dave Wengroth's book on my bedside table, so I'm going to read that. But no, I don't. I do bristle. I'm the worst example of that kind of historian who's maybe over concerned with defending the boundaries or saying no, you don't understand. You've not done the work to gain access to this mystic power that we historians have. But I think it's really hard to read Piketty's book and make those arguments that this is an interloper who doesn't understand how history is done. Now we can pick arguments with aspects of his approach to doing history, but I think this is what Ken is pointing out is that actually he does a pretty good job here. Yeah, it's schematic. He's proposing these different forms of inequality regime, proprietarianism, social democratic neo-proprietarianism, trifunctional. So it's schematic in that sense. And although he's proposing a kind of evolutionary pattern of movement through these, he does also allow lots and lots of space for events, for turning points, for contingency, for power, for agency. So this is not some really kind of basic preordained teleological history where things are just going to get continuously worse till we're ruled by a tiny group of oligarchs, even if that is where we end up. This is a history that's schematic, but complexly so, if that makes sense. And I think that's really what Ken is pointing to. Now, we have some questions about that, and then the introduction raises some of those questions. Well, how do these switch points occur? If ideology is so powerful, and in particular if elite ideology is so powerful, then surely that can prevent the kind of groundswell of new ideas that's going to lead to a switch point. Which we see at the start of the 20th century with the shift away from highly proprietarian ideologies towards social democracy. So there's nitpicking, if you like, and it's nitpicking on a big scale. But if that makes sense. But within this highly schematized big history, there is a lot of nuance and a lot of allowance for things to slip and and slide, which is what we historians like, of course.
Yeah.
We don't like things to be too neatly tied down. And the other thing I would say, although it's big history, and there is some ancient history, as I recall, it's a while since I've read the book. This is essentially an early modern and modern history.
Right.
So we're not talking about Homo sapiens and millennia.
Right,
We're
right.
talking about some centuries. So, and I think Ken, and as all of us would, but what Ken is really doing in that very first essay is setting up those questions of how do we treat Piketty as a historian, and really teeing the whole thing up by saying, yes, we should be treating him seriously as a historian. And then the rest of us go on, or the rest of the contributors go on to pick holes.
The rest, I guess that's right.
And
That's what we're good at, after all.
Right.
Yeah. And by the way, you this is also part of a debate within the historical profession. Witness the history manifesto of 2014, and one of the nastier phrases you can hurl at a colleague who is to say, "Oh, you're a synthesizer."
I wear that moniker
you're
proudly,
a
by the way.
popularizer.
Yes.
Yeah, and as opposed to saying, "Oh wow, you're somebody who is reaching a much larger audience," and having them, look at, not just the quote, the lessons of history, unquote, but oh wow, this is complex. This is hard. It's the secret sauce is that there's no secret sauce. It's to use a contemporary military analogy, you do have all these really neat modern technologies that can kill large numbers of people at once, but you still have to have the phrase boots on the ground or be able to hold the hill. And for be good historians, you want to look at the big picture, if only to attract a larger audience, which is what Piketty's done, but also to let's look at the very local level. And I think that's what all of our contributors are doing, and Ken sets the stage particularly well.
Yeah.
And I if I can add one thing, I think early on in the introduction we say that historians tend to make very bad politicians because our default answer is always, well, it's complicated. Well, yes, it is, but maybe sometimes we cling to that as a comfort blanket.
Yeah, for sure we do, I think.
And Piketty's trying to pull it away from us a bit.
Heidi Tworak has this article, Novels and Newspapers, in Piketty's Capital and Ideology. And I have to say, I really like in his earlier book, Capital in the 21st Century, I really like the way he used, like, Jane Austen, for instance. I often hold this up as like how we can bring together literature and economic analysis in like fruitful ways, in ways that kind of show us pictures of the world more richly than we can just do with data. But this kind of goes to, Andy, your mention of kind of elites and elite discourse, or like elite thinking. Part of what Heidi's showing there in her piece is that, Piketty does tend to draw on elite literatures, with Austen being a clear example, I would think, and doesn't kind of focus on, novels, the working class, and newspapers read by working people. So, what does she want to say? Like, we will see if we open up the kinds of sources we use in the kind of media we look to. Jonathan, you want to take a first crack at that one?
Yeah, she's basically saying, what data are you using? That that Piketty is writing from the perspective of the ruled. Piketty is essentially writing from the perspective of the rulers, not the ruled. Which, by the way, is part of a larger issue in in history too. If you go back to the 60s and 70s,
Right.
oh wow, we've got. Hey, let's look at the voices that haven't been heard. And
Yeah.
in Texas, we're having a ferocious debate, as in many states, not just critical race theory, but the Battle of the Alamo. There's a
And what it
how
means and how to interpret
what
it.
what that means and who was there,
Yeah.
and it's taking on contemporary political issues. So,
Yeah.
if anything, Piketty is saying to historians, "Hey, your history is being politicized anyway. You might as well you might as well try to make it at least accurate, or have your perspective." But Heidi's view is that by looking at the Jane Austens, by not looking at looking at some of Robert Darnton's readings of the Paris underworld, or the censored books, what are we missing out on? It would be like, let's do a history of Washington D.C. from the view of the White House, of the White House society, as opposed to, oh yeah, there's this other city there too.
Well, and it seems,
And
Andy,
what are we missing?
to go back to
Sorry.
one of your points, and I think that's great, Jonathan. I think to go back to one of your earlier points, if we are interested in kind of theorizing these groundswells or turning points where like the other classes do come up and push back, then it seems like these other kinds of sources might be helpful for thinking through that side of the history, right?
Yeah, definitely. And it's not only Heidi making that point with respect to Piketty's use of literary sources, which, I think is narrow. He relies on a very narrow band of authors from a small number of countries, and I think there's very legitimate criticism there. But Atiba Patia is essentially making the same point when he says we need to look at the foot soldiers who propped up proprietarian ideologies, not just the elites, and then Johann Matthew talking about the very real impact of inequalities on the bodies of the oppressed, not just the enslaved certainly, but other groups in society as well. So, I mean, Heidi's not alone in making this point, but it's and we do, those voices are missing. This book can't do everything, and one thing it doesn't do is give much space at all to voices from below for history from below. But of course, that's a really difficult balancing act.
Exactly.
I guess I resist the title a bit because or the label, but I mean, I guess I do microhistory mostly. I write about increasingly tiny things.
Yes.
But doing that, it's Piketty would probably say, well, where's the structure?
Right.
Where's the structure in this that you're writing? How does this relate to systems?
Right.
How does this relate to institutions? Where's the agency? Where's the power in these very small stories that you like to tell? So, whilst pointing this out as a definite weakness of the book, I think it's also fair to acknowledge just how difficult that is to actually do to bring those into a kind of fruitful dialogue. And also, that perennial debate, not just in history but in social sciences, around structure and agency.
Yeah. Well, and also like whether to focus on elites or the working classes, or however we want to conceive of those things. I think that's a pendulum that swung back and forth. There was this kind of social history moment in the 60s and 70s and maybe even earlier, where it was, focusing on the common people was the goal. And then I think there was some kind of reaction to that with, Sven Beckert and others starting to study elites again. And maybe, in some, for my taste, maybe we've gone too much in the elite history, intellectual history direction in my own fields, like history of technology. And, I've been arguing for a kind of return to a kind of social history of technology and like what the lived reality is with technological change. So again, like there's a lot. One thing I like about your special issue is it does raise all these deep methodological and theoretical questions about how we get balance right and who we're looking to. It's really juicy in that way for historians to chew on. Jonathan, you have a thought?
Yeah, and if I
Thank you. Yeah. No, Andy, go ahead.
I was just gonna, butt in really briefly. For a book that's deeply concerned with historical change and development, this book doesn't have a very clear theory of change.
Right. Yeah, there's an irony, right? Yeah.
So, yeah, Jonathan.
Yeah, it's all the oh gosh, and one of the articles looking at the ancient regime, Mary O'Sullivan says, she does a very nice thing. Okay, you talk about the threefold division of society. Well, what about these commoners who are in the city, ambitious, and moving up in the where do they fit in?
Yeah.
Piketty, and the advantage of theory from above is sort of like physics. Let's assume there's no friction and we can model and the modeling works great. What microhistorians do, if you want to call it that, they're biologists. We get down in the weeds. Why are the grapes in this side of the field produce so much better wine than the grapes from that side of the field? And one of the challenges is how do we mix those together? And if nothing else, Piketty may be the economist that spawns 1,000 historical articles.
Yeah. I like that O'Sullivan article a lot. It's called Constructing a Big History of Inequality, because on the one hand, it does do the kind of historian's thing of saying, like, look, when we go this far out and look this big, we need to attend to what's lost in that kind of approach. But where she goes with that, I mean, that could be the punchline and end of the story, but where she goes with that is that she sees then, opportunity for, I think she calls it like muscular engagement or something like that, of like going in, with Piketty in mind, with the questions he raises, then going in with the, more microscopic approaches of historians and really engaging and seeing what comes out of it. So it's a really kind of, I think it offers a nice picture for a productive road forward, other than just saying like, you're being too much of an economist or something, which is a risk.
Yeah, and I think that Mary's done marvelously. What can we take? Here are our issues with Piketty. Here's where here's where we can go from here. And I think all of the issues we're trying to be as constructive as possible, and thinking of this larger issue of how can we as historians respond to larger societal issues of the 21st century.
That's right.
And we're going to find out.
Yeah. And Jonathan just said something a moment ago about spawning 1,000 historical articles. And I think that's right. Piketty's given us a framework, if we choose to follow it, within which we could work. So, I'm sat here in Denmark, which is everyone's favourite exemplar, poster boy for social democracy. All of the time, I see this, particularly in the American.
Oh my God, man, we bring you guys up all the time. It's just like Scandinavia in general. But so we're this. I say we. I'm obviously not Danish. But
that Norwegian accent.
No, but we're poster boys, for the right who want to say, "Good God, you don't want to live in Denmark."
Yeah.
The middle classes can't afford cars. I don't know if you saw that recently. The previous American ambassador to Denmark said that the middle classes here couldn't afford to drive, and then the progressive left in the US says, look at this wonderful society. But the reality is, in the mid 19th century, the Scandinavian countries were, and my colleagues are probably going to kill me now, were deeply unequal, absolutist monarchies, pre-industrial. There is not some genius loci at work in Scandinavian that makes everyone happy collectivists, right? This was a program of work that was undertaken by organizations in civil society, by trade unions in particular, by political parties, by groups within business, for example, in the dairy industry that pioneered cooperative organization. And I have lots of colleagues, political scientists and historians at CBS and many elsewhere who work on these issues, right? So the switch point in Scandinavia from being highly proprietarian to social democracy, was not some naturally occurring event that we can't explain. It's not some mystery. It was a program of work that we can study historically, and those more focused historical studies can, if we choose to, be slotted into this bigger framework that Piketty provides us.
That makes a lot of sense to me.
Yeah. Sorry, I went on a rant now.
No, man, that was great.
But yeah, and one thing that historians look at is change over time, and Scandinavia is one of the economic success stories. In terms of, again, go back a century, and this is in his latest book, the one we are, Piketty says, "Guy, if you take the big view, if you step back, and look at things a century or two or a couple generations, overall, standards of living are up. In some forms of inequality are decreasing, particularly racial and gender inequality. But economic equality, which had gone down, is going up. So, and it's what." Certainly from contemporary political situation, it's that increase in economic inequality, and efforts to increase or decrease political or gender and racial inequality that are triggering a lot of frictions in contemporary societies. But these, as Heidi shows, as Mary O'Sullivan, as Ken showed, these are not new issues.
Yeah.
And one of our, how can we link the micro with the macro, and have the right lessons of history being drawn, or at least the right questions to ask.
Yeah.
Including who's not included in this conversation, or who's not being cited.
So the second half of the special issue is more focused on specific historical interpretations and in often specific moments, though some of them could cover pretty broad periods of time as well. But it opens with Richard John's article, Political Contestation and the Second Great Divergence. And the Second Great Divergence is this moment in the late 19th century in the U.S. and other places where, there's a lot of economic growth. And Richard is a friend and a mentor. He's been a guest on the podcast before, but I thought it was like the most Richard John type of essay in a good way, because it was basically like, Piketty hasn't done his homework, right? He hasn't read up on this period. And so he's relying on old scripts that, are kind of outdated is a word he uses. And so, yeah, just like talk about, so this is like, I think that the way I was reading it, it was wonderfully, Richard is using examples for the telegraph and telephone industry, which are things he knows very well because he wrote Network Nation, this big book about that stuff. But I also, kind of saw it in that kind of Mary O'Sullivan way of like, if we're going to do these giant books, and I bump into this all the time with my own work, there's just a limit to like what we can read and how well we can know any period, and so we kind of fall back on scripts that are around, and maybe too easy scripts. But I don't know. I mean, Andy, how did you read Richard's contribution to the overall special issue?
Yeah, so earlier we were talking about the lack of political economy generally in business history, or the relative neglect of political economy, and Richard's directing us to take that seriously, and obviously he focuses on monopoly and anti-monopoly, which he's writing a big book on.
Right, that's right. Yep.
On now, so that fits naturally into his current pattern of work, and he does take Piketty to task to an extent, and as you say, that's kind of quite a Richard John thing to do,
right?
Which, Richard, if you're going to listen to this, we mean in an extremely
we mean it in the most loving way, Richard. I can't imagine a more loving way to put it, but it is, it's a historiographical argument saying, he hasn't done his homework, and that's a yeah, Jonathan,
and he's right.
Yeah, he's right.
But it's also, I should say, that challenge of how do you stay abreast in so many fields?
Yeah, exactly.
And one of the ways of doing that is you form teams.
Yeah.
And I think, and we mentioned this in a footnote, one of Piketty's contributions is he's putting a lot of his data online.
Yeah.
He's got these huge data sets. And by the way, he even had, if you go to the website, he even said, hey, here's a PowerPoint of my major points with graphics. Here's the short, here's the short PD, here's the short PowerPoint, here's the really, really long one.
Mm-hmm.
So he's doing something that historians do poorly, that he's getting teams, he's getting the money to create the teams, he's storing the data, he's making it available. This is big academia. And I think one of our challenges, which I should have written more about, is how do we respond to this in an institutional or organizational way?
Yeah.
So that, I may not have done my homework, but I can rely on Andy or Yuli to say, hey, we've done this. This is what you have to say. One of the jokes is trying to organize historians is like herding cats.
Mm-hmm.
Piketty is able to accomplish so much in part because he's working, and he gives credit to this large team of people that he's dealing with, and the resources to do that. And I think that's one of the unstated challenges or issues that we should be thinking about. He may have spawned 1,000. He may spawn 1,000 historical articles, but is there a way we can organize those into a fleet?
Yeah.
And Richard's in that essay is not saying, Thomas Piketty doesn't perfectly understand the political economy of anti-monopoly in late 19th century America, therefore the whole book's wrong.
Yeah.
I mean, that's very, very far from what he's doing.
Right.
And it's incumbent on us to respond to those places where we think we can add to and advance the debate, but to do so, positively and constructively, and by looking at contestation there between, really amongst elite groups, between big business and big government. Richard's beginning to show us ways we can address what we've identified, both in the special issue and in this conversation today, as one of the weaknesses, which is that there's relatively poor explanation for historical change in Piketty's book. So he is picking apart one of those switch moments that Piketty talks about, to look at how change might have come about in that particular situation. And interestingly, for the discussion we had earlier about elites and non-elites, as I say, this was a contestation that was taking place between two different aspects or dimensions, essentially, of the same elite.
Mm-hmm.
And in Richard's case, he's looking at change that did happen. In Mary O'Sullivan's case, it's change that really didn't happen or tried to happen but didn't. And that one of the big one of the challenges of history is that we tend to look at, especially history of technology, business history, we tend to look at what succeeded. We look at the Exxons and the so far the Teslas of the world.
Let's hope not.
We don't look, but we don't look at the Rivians. We don't look. There's a lot of failed efforts at change, and and it's easy to say, oh, they were premature, but it's more of, well, they didn't think so at the time. So we looking a lot more what didn't occur, the changes, efforts to change, I think would also thicken our appreciation or deepen our appreciation of what did. And I think that's another call, a fruitful area of investigation and cooperation.
Andy mentioned earlier Tiba Pertila. Is that how you pronounce the person's name? There's this.
I think so. Yeah.
There's a article on financial professionals and the formation of proprietarian ideology, which Andy mentioned earlier. Kind of looks. I mean, it warmed my heart because I always write about lower level bureaucrats and finding myself writing about those folks instead of the super elites. So it's kind of pushing us to look at the lower level financial folks actually making the system work, which I'm on board with kind of automatically because of my setup. But what does Pertila think that we gain by looking to these other kinds of folks? Andy, you want to give a shot at that one?
Yeah, so I think one thing we pick up in the introduction to this special issue is, and this relates to the questions we've already been talking about change, it's this idea of an enactment. So it's okay talking about ideology, but obviously if we're also talking about the material world, we can't just stay floating around in pure ideation. So ideology needs to be enacted. And I think Atiba does a fantastic job there of showing the mechanics, the concrete mechanics, in that essay, particularly in terms of human capital, if we want to call it that, of how the elites simply can't operate through kind of pure force of will, but the enactment of ideology requires the recruitment of these kind of mid-level bureaucrats. And I think that essay is a really great example of the kind of dialogue that historians can productively strike up with Piketty. And again, as with Richard's kind of large scale picture looking at contestation, again helps us to begin to unpick some of those questions that perhaps Piketty unsurprisingly leaves incompletely answered, around change, for example.
Right. Well, and to add the richness of the picture, that we do have elite contestation between elites, and we also have people lower down the ladder who are very bought into the system and are enacting it. So it just riches up things, right? I really liked. I found Johann Matthew's essay, Embodied Capital in the History of Inequality, on bodies and the effects of inequality on bodies to be, it kind of surprised me at first because it was kind of felt different than the other ones. But I mean, it's a great essay and I really liked it. Jonathan, what do you feel like you gained from like Matthew saying that we need to bring the body back into it and looking at how, you know, inequality plays out in bodies?
The American healthcare system.
Yeah. Yeah.
I rest my case. No, but he's, there are people, we are writing about history, we're writing about people, we're writing about their bodies, and this is something that we don't take for granted, or we don't explore, but we're seeing, and if I was writing contemporary polemic, I was saying, look at the uneven impact of COVID,
Right.
Where we're seeing real, literally life-altering, life-changing results based on your access to health, based on environmental justice. That inequality has, tell me your zip code and I'll tell you your average life.
Mm-hmm.
You're seeing that at the same time. Let's look at these national level. If you really want to live a long time, live in Japan. Why is that? So you've got multiple facts, but he's bringing. We talk about inequality, but let's look at some of the actual impacts or some of the possible effects of this.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a very effective reminder that when we write history, we're writing about people, and there's a lot that we don't write about, that we take for granted, and that it's going beyond the graphics, it's going beyond the charts, it's getting to, oh gosh, I'm in a wheelchair and I can't move out of my apartment. I can't move from my apartment because there's no working elevator, or one of the more recent example, one of the greatest efforts at physical mobility in the last couple of decades in the U.S. was the Americans with Disability Acts. That's a political act to let's reduce health inequalities, which, by the way, beneficial aspects for everybody else, as anybody who's used a rollerboard in a city street can tell you. Mm-hmm. So I'm sorry, I'm verging away, but it's a wonderful way of getting not just to talking about inequality is bad, but this is a way of looking at it and understanding it that we normally don't think of, and that we should.
It gets us out of ideation too and makes it very concrete, right? I mean, it's like, what is the lived reality of this thing? It reminds me of some sociologists I like. I think it's in Bordeaux, but especially this guy, John Levy Martin at University of Chicago, I like, where, class positions kind of become embodied. And if we think about obesity and cancer and so many other things, diabetes and so many other outcomes, especially in the U.S., obviously, they're so tightly coupled to class and race and these other issues. Andy, do you feel like there's anything in the Matthew essay that stood out to you that we haven't really chatted about yet?
I like the passion in that essay.
Mm-hmm.
It's angry at times, I think. And again, I mean that in a really positive way. One something we raise in the introduction is that Piketty never really directly addresses why inequality is bad.
Yeah.
And none of us who contributed to the special issue disagree.
Right.
But there is a real question. Mm-hmm. Why is this a bad thing?
Right.
Maybe it's a necessary price for growth and wealth generation. So I think Johann's essay, as you've both just been discussing, is a reminder that inequality has real consequences that are felt in a visceral, painful sense.
Yeah.
And Johann really takes us back to the material in the most basic sense of the human body. And as I say, there's a kind of passion and almost an anger there, not an anger at Piketty, and an anger about the inequity that is salutary, really, and important.
That's a really good way to put it. Go ahead, Eddie.
No, I've done.
Oh, I think that that's a really good way to put it, because sometimes, when I read his earlier book, which I spent a lot more time with than the second one, Capital in the 21st Century, it almost seems like inequality's bad because it leads to bad outcomes like violent revolutions and those kinds of problems, which we mentioned earlier, by the way, as like one picture that he has, that this leads to war and civil war and such. But, this is like, no, Matthew's essay makes it clear that it's like, no, there's real suffering happening as a result of these systems, and in the most tangible ways possible. You can't get more tangible than the pain and the disease and the addictions and all these other things that come from these kinds of inequalities. So I really like that way of putting it, Andy. It's just it's a stark reminder.
Yeah. And we need it sometimes, even those of us who are concerned about these issues or make it part of our politics. We need that reminder, I think, sometimes.
I thought on a kind of road to wrapping up our conversation today, I was thinking, what are your kind of hopes coming out of this volume? And, what are you either seeing? We can just focus on business history for now, if it makes it easier to kind of have a space for history of technology and business history. What are you seeing that gives you hope, already, maybe? Or, what do you think, what are you hoping to see more of, having gone through this experience with this special issue? Jonathan, you want to give it a first shot?
What would I like to see in the future improvements? Editors who can respond faster to requests from people submitting paper. No, that's
we can talk about the professional side of our work life too. Yeah, there are issues. I guess I was meaning more in terms of topics and research areas.
No, I think a greater awareness of the issue of inequality. And I think these papers have given several useful approaches that historians can use to do. But also, what I'd like to see is us reaching out to the economists, to other professions, and saying, how can we work together? How can we, maybe in workshops, maybe in publications.
Totally.
Right, which means we have to go out and not necessarily beat the bush, but say, together we can add, a more diverse group of academics looking at this may be able to create more,
Yeah. I love that. I feel the same way about my kind of stuff on recent technological and economic change. And, it's really economists who first drawn our attention to what we can call the lack of innovation and lack of productivity change as a result of that. And historians of technology have not had much to say about that, frankly, or people in STS, a broader interdisciplinary field. No. So it's I think there is a kind of call for a certain kind of interdisciplinarity and, thinking with economists and others that we sometimes shun, frankly, the word economist comes up in some business or history circles, and it's like, ew, gross, those guys.
Well, it's all also, and this is something we don't get into in the book, is just the methodologies that we use
yes.
are so different. our approaches are so different. I've attended a couple of innovation conferences in the last month or two, and you have some of these economists coming and information scientists. Okay, well, we've looked at this data set of 10,000 papers, and we've done it, and we're thinking, ooh, this is not a historian speaking.
Yeah.
So I think one of our challenges is we need to go forth and talk with these different groups and try to understand what we don't understand about each other. But again, that means moving away from our traditional approaches and the traditional reward systems of the monograph, the article. How do we do a collaborative work?
Perennial
Because
issue.
the effort that we put here, standard issue. There to quote, possibly to quote, paraphrase Piketty, there's nothing new under the sun, just various forms. But we're getting better. But we're getting better sunlight as we rise.
And Andy, how about you? I mean, things that you're seeing that are already making you hopeful, or things you hope to see in kind of business history in the next decade or so?
So I think thinking a little bit more locally, I agree with everything Jonathan just said, but thinking a little more locally within history, there's sometimes been, I think, an unnecessary separation between business history and the new history of capitalism.
Yeah.
And I think Piketty's intervention could enliven that juncture between those two subfields. I mean, obviously there's plenty of exchange and there's quite a lot of overlap of personnel, but there is still clearly felt to be enough distinguishing them to identify two distinct fields. When I think often we could be working in far more complementary ways. So that might be one hope.
Yeah.
As Jonathan said, I think and a historical attention to the roots of inequality would be great. One thing Piketty really doesn't do is, and we just talked about bodies and the materiality of bodies. He almost completely black boxes what we, for shorthand, we might call the real economy.
Yeah.
There's virtually no firms. In this book. There's virtually no industrialists. And we don't have an essay that discusses this. We discussed it a lot in emails between. We had incredibly rich email conversations over many months putting this together, and this is where we discuss this topic. There are no firms.
Yeah.
There are no industries. There are no industrialists. There are no financiers. There are no entrepreneurs.
Right.
There are no innovators. There's no technology. There's no plant. There's no factories.
Yeah.
I'm exaggerating a bit, but not much.
No.
So I think, and you've talked about kind of a lack of attention to some of these issues in the history of technology and in STS. The role of firms and the role of technology, the role of entrepreneurship and innovation in not simply supporting or perpetuating inequality, but actually in generating it in the first place. So I think there is a lot of very fruitful potential there.
Yep.
And of course, business history is already paying a great deal of very welcome attention to racial inequality, to gender inequality, in terms of discriminatory treatment, discriminatory access to opportunities, a whole range of issues of more kind of specific inequalities and inequities.
Yeah.
But yeah, just to take that framework that Piketty's provided us and start filling in
Yeah.
the blanks and to to start grounding it in the material as well.
Yeah. Well, guys, this has been a lot of fun, just like I knew it would be. Thank you so much for taking the time to chat with me today. And thanks for putting together this special issue.
Oh, thank you so much for inviting us, and
Yeah.
thank you for taking the initiative to start your podcast, keep it going, and to bring us together across the continents.
Yeah.
Thanks, guys.
Yeah, thank you, Lee, and thanks, Jonathan.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of our podcast. Peoples and things, like most things in this world, depends on the work of many people. I want to thank my brother Jake Vinsel for writing the music for the show. I want to thank my buddy Juliana Castro for designing the logos for the podcast. Check out her work at julianacastro.co. Peoples and Things is a production of Virginia Tech Publishing and is supported by the Center for Humanities and the University Libraries at Virginia Tech. Production activities are hosted in the Athenaeum, a space in the library that acts as a hub for digital humanities teaching, learning, and creation. Joe Fort is the media production manager with Virginia Tech Publishing and serves as producer and sound engineer for Peoples and Things. Mandy Lamb is the production assistant. For information about other podcasts from Virginia Tech Publishing, visit publishing.vt.edu. I also want to thank you for listening. Thanks.